Coming up in the Authorpreneur Podcast.
I always like to make sure that the listener or a reader knows I like to look at story separated from writing. And I have no interest really in telling somebody how to write their novel. I think there's a lot of ways that you can write your novel. And when I say writing, I mean style, I mean diction, I mean how you structure your sentences, Now, I do talk a little bit about style in this book only because Aristotle had some stuff to say about style. And so I wanted to comment it. And it doesn't mean I don't have.
Welcome to the Authorpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, mystery author Amelia D. Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at authorpreneurpodcast.com/podcast. Hello, writers. In this episode of the Authorpreneur Podcast, I chat with Douglas Vigliotti about his book, Aristotle for Novelists, 14 Timeless Principles on the Art of Story. I love talking to him about Aristotle for Novelists because it reminded me of my screenwriting roots, and it was nice to look back on my writing journey. Also, I loved his book because it was short enough to read in one sitting, but still had timeless principles that I could walk away with and apply to my next book. So if you haven't grabbed a copy, I highly recommend you do. The book is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook formats. But before we get into the interview, here's a bit about Doug. Douglas Vigliotti is the author of 4 books, including Aristotle for Novelists and Tom Collins' A Slightly Crooked Novel, which is available to listen to on Slightly Crooked, Good Stories Told Well, a podcast that also features his raw and unorthodox poem collection, Mini Heartbreaks, or Little Poems About Life. He's also the host of Books for Men, a weekly literary podcast to inspire more men to read. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. If you've heard something in this episode that was helpful to you and you'd like to support the show, then buy me a coffee for as little as $2 at buymeacoffee.com/author ADHey. So one of the things I did like about your book was the fact that it wasn't too long, because sometimes when you get a book where they talk about the craft of writing, it can be a real doorstopper and it's hard to read from start to finish. But yours was short enough to read in one sitting, but it wasn't overwhelming, because when you read something in one sitting, especially nonfiction, it can be I'm quite an anxious person, so I get quite overwhelmed. But I felt it was enough information, but also at the same time, it was enough information to go through and use like as a reference thing, just by the fact that it's divided up into the principles, and you can go back and say, look at principle 3 or something again at a later stage. That's one of the things I really liked about that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will say the book, when I originally wrote it, it was almost twice as long.
Oh, really?
I worked really hard to reduce it into what you see today. And I give the advice in the book to cut the fat or trim the fat and keep it moving. And so I had to kind of own up to that. I owe that to my editor. She's great. She held my feet to the fire with that. But it's not something that is really hard for me because I get impatient when I read. One of the things that, you described there is, doorstopper. And I do like a lot of, I don't want to say that I don't like long books, because there's a purpose for them and there's a point for them, and I do enjoy them. It is harder to keep someone's attention for that long.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm the type of person where say it, move on, say it, write it, move on. It's a lot easier for me to do that on the page than it is to do it speaking. And so I really try to exercise that when I'm writing. There's a theory that I talk about in the book called 1 + 1 = 1/2. And it means twice of the same thing repeated actually reduces its power to 1/2.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying it once well. And that actually hinges on an Aristotle idea, really. And Aristotle talks a lot about the essentialness of everything that you are writing. And to me, staying as tight as you can to the material that you are trying to speak to is really important because, as we said before, people have their attention spans are waning a little bit, and knowing when or going off on a beaten path is really important. It's not to say that you can't, especially in a novel. There's a lot of different competing theories on how far you go take this thread, right? But it's always important to know, at least in a story sense, how far am I deviating from the core story, the primary story of this novel. And someone might say, well, that's this character, that character. No. There is a through line of a story that you are trying to tell. And this is something that I talk about in the book. And how, when you deviate from that, it's not that it's bad. It's just you're diluting the essence of the story. And unless you're really utilizing those deviations to enrich the overall theme or the overall storyline, you could really be doing a disservice. And I think that that's just something to really pay attention to in a story sense, but just in an actual structural sense. If you look at a lot of books today, especially popular ones, they're written in really short, digestible paragraphs or scenes, or we've really moved away from that more lengthy, elaborate telling of something. And I think, again, that goes back to that technical evolution that we've already described a little bit earlier in this chat.
Yeah, I think when you read like an Agatha Christie novel and then you go and read like a more modern mystery, it can be harder to get into the story, I found. And I think that might have something to do with it. Like, she's still a great writer and I love her books, but I've noticed that comparatively, like, the chapters are longer than the more bite-sized chapters you get in especially the traditional mystery. Like, cozy mystery is a little different, that the chapters are still quite longer, but the paragraphs are short.
Sure.
For that reason that you pointed out. So what made you choose to write about Aristotle for novelists instead of that more traditional how to write a novel or how to plot a novel style of book? Why did you choose to focus on Aristotle and to write from Aristotle and the Poetics, and not just straight, this is how you plot?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I always, before I answer this question, I always like to make sure that the listener or a reader knows I like to look at story separated from writing. And I have no interest really in telling somebody how to write their novel. I think there's a lot of ways that you can write your novel. And when I say writing, I mean style, I mean diction, I mean how you structure your sentences, Now, I do talk a little bit about style in this book only because Aristotle had some stuff to say about style, and so I wanted to comment it. And it doesn't mean I don't have preferences, as I just alluded to before when I talked about the 1 + 1 = 1/2 theory. But my main objective with this was to tackle what I believe is intrinsic in 99% of stories in Western culture. And the reason why it is intrinsic is because it is rooted in the material that I am speaking on in this book. And I learned that when I started to investigate how to tell stories myself. And what I quickly realized was that almost all dramatic stories, so stories on whether it's the screen or on the stage, they all derived from Aristotle's Poetics. I started reading about filmmakers like Aaron Sorkin or David Mamet, or you have these classic screenwriting or story guides, like people talk about Robert McKee, or all of them funneled back into Aristotle. They all mention Aristotle. They all talk about Aristotle's Poetics. They all reference him. And so I said, instead of going down this rabbit hole when I was first learning, let me read Poetics. And so then I ended up reading multiple translations. And then that's how I taught myself how to tell story. And now when I watch something or I read something, I'm looking at the story through the lens of these principles and these ideas, not the writing per se, the story. And, I wrote a few novels, And I was in the middle of, not writing anything. And this idea wouldn't leave me alone. Like, why is it that screenwriters and writers of drama have utilized these principles forever and these ideas forever, but there's nothing really for novelists? And it was bothering me. And so I wrote the book, and then I showed it to a few writer friends, and they were like, man, you've got to get this out into the world. This could help so many people. And so that was the genesis of the book, really. And then, it was written only because it didn't exist and I wanted it to. And I thought that they were truly ideas that are going to be able to help all writers. Okay. And I know that a lot of people are thinking plotters, pantsers, but I think that this work will help all writers. And I can get more into that, but.
Okay. So when you wrote the book, did you have a particular sort of audience in mind? Because I know sometimes when you write nonfiction, you do have a specific sort of ideal sort of reader, but did you consider that, or was it more
anybody who's trying to write a novel? It's for novelists. Aristotle for novelists. Now I say that, if you are trying to tell a story in any fashion, whether it's on the page, on the screen, or in your life, and I say in your life because the thing that I think that drew Aristotle so much to storytelling in general is because, most people know him as a philosopher. Yeah. And that's because story is so intertwined with how we live as human beings. I think that was the entry point for him in more criticism on storytelling more broadly. So when he said poetics was a term that applied to a much greater net than what we think of it. He's not talking about poems, or he's talking about, in this book, he's talking about tragedies. And he also wrote about comedies, but that work was actually lost and it was never recovered. But, I think that the main reason why he was drawn to this material, as I just mentioned, was because it was so intrinsically linked with how we live. And so I think anybody could benefit from this who is trying to tell a story. But if you are a novelist, whether you're writing your first novel or your 10th novel, whether you're a plotter, whether you're a pantser, I think that this work is something that you potentially could gain some insight from. If it's not only to build your novel, to see if these principles are inside of the work that you have created. And I think that is a really powerful thing. Also, going and watching TV shows, going and watching movies, and seeing the principles that I talk about in this book. They're in the shows and they're in the movies. They may be some tougher to spot for some people, for some more than others, and definitely in novels more than film or TV, because when you're watching film or TV, as we just alluded to, everything is stripped down and it's very lean. So it makes the principles much more pronounced. But I think that that's a great way to view them and then see them inside of the novels that you are reading, because novels are a little bit looser in their structure and a little bit more extraneous than film and TV. And they're not always necessarily built around dramatic structure or 3-act structure. But I've found that even when I'm reading literary work, I could spot these principles in that work, even if they weren't created with this type of theory behind it at all. And it was really just a writer exercising their pantserness, or whatever you want to call it.
I have to admit, when I made the switch from doing screenwriting, I dabbled in a bit of nonfiction, and then I went to fiction. I was really confused about how to actually structure a novel, because screenwriting is quite rigid in its structure, and that's what I was used to. And I was using it like a security blanket, which is why I created that first series of my podcast. I needed to figure out how to structure a novel. And at the time, I was like this really, how do I describe it? I outlined every scene in my book. I don't tend to write in chapters. I tend to write in scenes. And Yeah,
like
I
a
have this.
screenwriter would.
Yeah, I have like this massive spreadsheet. I have slowly gotten away from that because what will happen is I'll write the outline, and that's the most creative part of it because that's where the ideas come from. And then writing the first draft will be the most painful experience of my life. Yeah.
I think all these different strategies for how you actually get the first draft down, there are, you talk to 100 writers, they're going to have 100 different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
It's a great, there's a great book by Haruki Murakami called Novelists as a Vocation. And he says that I can't remember the exact quote, but he says that basically he's like, you talk to 100 different novelists, there's going to be 100 different ways of doing it. And I think that that's one of the most daunting things, especially as a first-time novelist, when you're trying to figure out, how am I going to structure this, or how am I going to grapple with the idea of telling this story? And that's the reason why I wrote this book, essentially, because, for instance, I'll give you an example here, as we're talking a lot in theory right now. If you look at a story, a basic story, whether it's on the page, whether it's literary fiction, romance, thriller, you look at TV shows, films, stories in general, life stories, Amelia's story, Doug's story. There's core elements to that, and in a Western sense, you have a protagonist. So Doug Vigliotti is your protagonist. Amelia Hay is your protagonist, who wants something that's going to change depending on what type of story you're telling and how big or small. But I want something, you want something. And there's obstacles standing in our way that are both internal and external. So your internal obstacles would be flaws and shortcomings and imperfections, and your external obstacles could be your mother, your spouse, your friend, the bad guy. It depends on what story you're telling. But all stories have a protagonist who wants something with obstacles standing in their way. So if we don't start with that and understand who we're telling the story about, what do they want, and what is preventing them from getting it, you could start any way you want, but realize that whether a storyteller knows it or not, if we go and you look at your favorite novel, your favorite movie, that structure is going to be in there. Even in a character study where you have, like a kaleidoscope look at a story where you have multiple characters and you're following multiple storylines, there's still that central storyline. And, this is what Aristotle was talking about when he was talking about a tragic story and a comedic story. And a tragic story is, does your protagonist succumb to those obstacles and end up worse off? Well, then we have a tragedy. Or do they overcome those obstacles and end up better off? Then we have a comedy. We're not talking about ha-ha laughs or tears and sad. We're talking about, does your protagonist end up worse off or better off? And a lot of people will ask the question, well, why does a tragedy work if we're watching our protagonist fail? And that's because in most tragic stories, we learn a greater truth about the world. Okay. Right? We learn something. We want to see justice served. It's like a headache that's throbbing. You want it to end. And I'll use an example of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, where, in that story, the protagonist is the father. And I apologize if I spoil this story for anybody, but it's been read by a lot of people. So the protagonist is the father, and he dies at the end. Why could we read a story about the father dying at the end? Because the core of the story, what it's saying to us, is that all humans die, and every boy must go on and live the world on his own. And we know that by the end of the story. And because we know that, we are okay with seeing our tragedy come to an end because it avails this larger truth about life to us that is satisfying. And all tragedies do that in some shape or form. Comedies work because the protagonist, Doug Vigliotti, Amelia Hay, we overcome our obstacles, and it's that Hollywood ending. 95% of stories told on the screen are comedic because they're easier to sell and people like them more. But that's how those structures of those stories work. And if now people say, well, what about TV shows? TV shows are just this is where my major gripe is with a TV show. Why I said to you at the beginning of this, I enjoy movies more than I enjoy TV shows, because TV shows, people will say, well, they're deeper character studies. They are, but they deviate so much. When I watch a television show, all I see, because of my understanding of the story, all I see is fat. I see excess story upon excess story upon excess story, and it's not condensed. When I see a 2-hour movie, a beautifully constructed 2-hour movie, and I can keep the whole thing in my mind's eye and see the arc of the story, and it's so nicely put together, it's so gratifying and so satisfying to me. And then when I watch a TV show that's giving me it goes off on the beaten path, developing this character, developing that character, and it might be entertaining, but it's not really doing anything for the central storyline. And to me, I'm looking at it like, man, we could have condensed this into a movie and it would have been so much better. It would have been so much more appealing to me. But yeah, I'm kind of going off of the beaten path right now. So let me pull it back in, and I'll give you a chance to build off that.
So I was thinking, how do Aristotle's storytelling principles apply to that character that doesn't really, personally, they don't change that much? Like the plot that's sort of going on, it sort of starts somewhere, there's a resolution to it. But like a character like Jack Reacher, where he just goes into a town, there's something going on, he walks out, his core values, his belief system, none of this changes. He just walks
Jack
in and
Reacher.
And also there's another sleuth who's the same thing. His belief system, I won't mention his name but he does a similar thing. He'll go into a case, he walks out. He's not fundamentally changed by the crimes he solves. He's just almost like a vessel to solve the crime. I know that's really horrible to say that, but they're essentially flat arc characters. How does it apply to that situation?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, and this is why necessarily I don't always like referring to it as a change. I talk about it in a change in fortune, because that's how Aristotle talks about it. So stories have so plot is a plot in an Aristotelian plot has 3 characteristics, right? You have a change in fortune for your protagonist. So either they go from bad to good or good to bad. So they end up worse. They start off okay and they end up worse off. They start off okay and they end up better off, right? The second piece is your sequence of events. To be an Aristotelian plot, that change in fortune has to come from the sequence of events. So even though in a Jack Reacher story, let's say, he doesn't actually change, he doesn't improve off of his weakness, let's say, or the things that bother him. He ultimately, to save the day, has to temporarily deal with those imperfections and with those flaws. So he's moving away from his flaw into a strength. So he probably does something where he finds himself, and I don't know the Jack Reacher stories too well, but he probably, because like all comedic stories, they find themselves in a pit, like not in like, down in the dumps, like all the world is about to end. I don't have the girl yet. The murderer is on the loose and I'm in jail, and like you're in the worst possible place you could be. And to get out of that, usually that character needs to move away from their flaw temporarily and do something that's uncharacteristic to be able to save the day. Now, that doesn't mean by the end of the story, they are a brand new person. It means that they did it inside of that story so that way they can be better off, or, if it's the other way around, worse off. And so sequels and series, they often have a character who is dealing with the same imperfections and the same flaws season after season after season. I talk about this with Tony Soprano all the time. Tony Soprano is an angry, he's funny, he's angry. He can't get over the fact that he can never get approval from his mother. That little guy inside of him that drives him never leaves him. Even after the first season is over, when his mother dies, or the second season she dies, I can't remember. It happens at the beginning. There's 5 more seasons. He's still dealing with the repercussions of all of that season after season after season. But they each still have an arc to them inside of the actual season or inside of the series. So the reason why you love Jack Reacher is because you know you're going to get whatever he's struggling with. He's going to struggle with that in this season, but he's going to overcome it temporarily, and he's going to save the day. And that's why those characters tend to work. And it's also why people tend to be so drawn to them, because you're getting to see that character live the same story over and over and over again, just in different circumstances. And if you hit it with one of those characters, people can love it, right?
Yeah, because I've kind of had to create a character like that in one of my series. I've got 3. 2 of them are basically, one's like an earlier offshoot into that same world, following the same character, but them earlier in time. And I've also got a cozy mystery, but with cozy mysteries, the character can change a little bit more because it's expected. It's more focused on the character and who they are as they solve the crime. The crime, it's not secondary, but it's like the character is slightly more important.
Sure. It's a character-driven story.
Yeah.
This is where we have, I was getting to this when I was talking about TV shows and movies. Movies tend to be, now it's not that they're not character studies, because there are plenty of character study movies. But one of the things that a lot of people say is that TV is a better form to explore character than movies are, because movies tend to be more plot driven, which you alluded to at the beginning of this episode, of how structured a screenplay is and what ends up coming up on that screen. There are different types of novels in that regard. There are novels that are character driven, and there are novels that are plot driven. I read, as I alluded to before, across the literary spectrum, and I don't think a genre is one or the other. I think you have a character-driven thriller or a plot-driven thriller, a character-driven literary novel or a plot-driven literary novel. You're getting at something that is just as a more of a choice of the writer. Do you want it to be more of a character, focus on the character, or do you want it more on plot? I could tell you that Aristotle is pretty insistent in saying the number one most important thing of a story is plot. Yeah. Now, I know that this prickles up a lot of novelist hair, because a lot of, I just got through saying that most stories are a protagonist who wants something, obstacle standing in their way, and people come to the story because they want to explore their character. And I'm not even saying that isn't true. I'm just saying what Aristotle believes is plot is the most important element of your story. And that is because even in a character study, if you don't have a plot, tension, the structure that I just described to you before, it's going to be a very, very tough read for a lot of people. Yeah. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means it's going to be a very, and even more so today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Again, going back to what we were just talking about before with the evolutional change in technology, readers expect a certain thing. And there is a small subset of people who enjoy, and I might actually be included in that subset, subtle character portraits at times, indie movies that are paced slower, those type of things. But it's just not the norm. And it's a harder thing to get engagement from for most people because it's technology and entertainment has changed the way that we consume things. I'm not saying that writers shouldn't do it or try it if that's what they really want to do, but I would strongly urge most writers, whether they're writing literary, thriller, fantasy, romance, understanding plot and understanding what the core element of your story is and trying to stay close to that is a super skill that if you explore character within that, you're going to write an amazing story.
I find that the mystery genre kind of goes against the sort of I want it now sort of tech hangover because it is slower. It's not fast paced because quite every now and then I'll get someone who gets my book for free and they'll be like, oh, this isn't an edge of your seat book. And it's like, yeah, it's mystery. But there are some well-known writers in the mystery space and they do write something that's more heading towards a thriller, but they can do that because they're, that name, because they've got a household name, right, and they've got like a huge portion of fans that will just buy their next book because It's got their name on it. I guess that's something that I have kind of noticed. I'm not sure why I felt the need to bring it up because I thought it related to my next question.
I totally feel your pain. I understand exactly what you're describing. I often find that I like to read a lot of classics. I like to read a lot of books that aren't, I read a lot, but I would say probably only 10 of those books every year are what I would consider to be new fiction. Yeah. And the rest of it is fiction that is either written, many years ago or even 20 years ago. And it's interesting to see the trends of what was popular at a certain time and what is popular now. And I definitely notice with modern fiction, the speed is just so much faster. And, even in literary fiction or what's billed as literary fiction, if you go read a literary fiction from 20 years ago, it is, at least to me, a very different thing. There's a very different quality about it. We just seem to not have the patience anymore, and people just want things that start fast. I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, and I do read them every now and then, especially but it's just, I wouldn't say it's the norm today.
Yeah. So when I was reading your book, I particularly liked Principle 8, where you talk about how novels contain reversals and recognitions. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I particularly enjoyed it, probably because for me, I recognize it from screenwriting, and it's not often talked about that much. Yeah,
and so I was going to say, probably the reason why you recognize that is because it's directly related to screenwriting, but it's important to remember that screenwriting is a derivative of this, not this being a derivative of screenwriting. And so Aristotle, 2,300 years ago, was the person who was talking about reversals and recognitions, and how we see that usually administered. He says that in a plot, I said what makes up a plot before. What makes a plot complex versus simple is whether it is infused with a reversal, right? And so there's a reversal that happens in a story where you think something is going to happen and then it's something else. And if that's infused in a story, then it's what he calls a complex plot. Now, he's talking about on the macro sense of how you structure your story, but in a micro sense, scene by scene, let's say, or chapter by chapter, in screenwriting, you could see they talk about this using the words but and therefore, or versus using and, right? So this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens, but this happens. What is that but? It's a reversal. We think something good is going to happen, but something happens to interject that. Then the character goes off, something happens to interject that. But this happens, but this happens, but this. That's how all television shows are made. And that's how they infuse tension into stories. It's also in novels. It's just not it's most of the time, it's a little bit more subtle. So I always say to see a reversal in a novel, it's easier to first see them on the television screen or in a movie and say, oh yeah, okay, there it is. Because it happens in every scene. Doug walks into the room, but this happens. But Doug walks out. I use this example in the in the book, actually. I make a mock scene where a guy wakes up in the morning and he walks out to his car, and it was after, a one night stand, and he walks out to his car, and all of a sudden he gets to his car. He's trying to creep out in the morning, out of bed. It's like after the one night stand ends, he walks outside, he gets to his car, but he realizes he forgot his keys. Now, what does he have to do? He could either walk home or he could go in and get his keys. Of course, our guy's going to go back in and get his keys. So he goes in and get his keys, but now the girl is up. Okay, now what happens? You see what happens? It's always a but. It's never the guy walks out and this happens, and this happens, and it's always interlinked with a but this happens, a but that happens. And that's just all little micro reversals of fortune. So it was good. I finally got out of the house. And then boom, reversal. Got to get back into the house to get my keys. Boom, I think I'm going to escape. I think I'm going to be able to leave. She's up. Reversal. Now, I want to go to breakfast. Now I have to go to breakfast. Now it's like, it's always a but. And that's the easiest way to describe what a reversal is. A recognition is when a character doesn't know something and then he knows something or she knows something. So it's when you're going from when no knowledge to knowledge, and that could happen a lot of different ways in stories. It could happen through signs. It could happen through all different kinds of things. And Aristotle talks about all these in Poetics. But what Aristotle says is the most impactful recognitions occur when they are derived from the plot itself. So the structuring of the story unveils that recognition for your protagonist, and they learn something that they haven't learned before. And I go over all of this in the book. But another really good resource for this is if someone goes to YouTube and they type in Matt Stone and Trey Parker. I think those are the South Park creators. They have a little video that's about 4 minutes long, where they're teaching this class about but, and they're teaching how they create South Park. And of course, they're not talking about reversals and recognitions, but if you read this, you're saying, oh, yeah, Aristotle was talking about that 2,300 years ago. It was the same exact thing, except in a completely different language. And it built, on top of itself year after year after year, and it's still baked into stories today. And again, that's because if you think about it, we're telling stories in our lives this way. They happen sequentially. Therefore, this happens. Therefore, this happens. Therefore, this happens. I go on this podcast. Someone hears it. Therefore, this happens. Someone writes a book. They get inspired. Then this happens. Then that. Everything is sequential. Everything is consequential. It's cause and effect. And again, that's how lives unfold. So going back to Aristotle, that's how he. That's why this stuff. He could see it in the stories that we're telling because it's so intertwined with life.
Yeah, that's what I really enjoy about sort of 3-act structure, and because I haven't read Poetics. I've only sort of heard the information like second, third, 20th hand from, someone regurgitating it. But I think that's what I like about this particular sort of structure. It sort of imitates life. It's not too complicated. Because some story structures, even though they're probably based on this, become really complicated, and I find that I can't cope with complicated things because there's a really popular thing, sort of way of telling a story in this particular space that everyone loves. And I can't. I've got it on my bookshelf. I won't mention its name, but I can't read it because it's like my brain dies every time I open the book and I'll look at something. It's just so complex for me.
Yeah.
I think I'm more of a simple creature. I think it's probably closer to the truth.
I share that sentiment. The thing, I don't like feeling like I'm too boxed in. After all, I write fiction. I don't write screenplays. So I like having what I would call principles for reference, more than having, you must do this on page 5, you must do this on page 10. That doesn't work for me. I think there's a lot of exceptions for the rule, up to the rule rather, when you're writing fiction. But when you're looking at something that is principle based, where you can observe them in all types of stories, no matter what story is being told, I think it's just a much more powerful way to approach it. It's the way I learned, so I'm a little biased. After I wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
But I don't want someone to think that this is a formula.
Yeah.
This is a tool that you have now to see how stories are structured, like how stories work, not how you can write a story in this way. No. When you look at principle 10 or 11 or 12, when you're saying, is it, novels should be believable, novels should be cohesive, novels should be clear but not ordinary. These are all things, or novels should be logical rather. These are things, when you look at a story, if you don't believe it, you're not going to watch it.
Yeah.
Now, you're not looking at it thinking to yourself, do I believe this or do I not? Unless you're actually asking the question. But if they're doing a good job of suspending disbelief, which is the core responsibility of any storyteller, then you're watching it. If you don't believe it, you're not going to watch it. So when you say, oh, do I believe? Yeah, I believe this. Then that's why it's a principle. It's not a formula. It's baked into the story itself, and why it works and why it doesn't work. And I'm not the genius with this. I'm mining it from, the root material that then went on to be the reference for all of the stories that we have told since and are still telling today in many cases.
Well, thank you for coming on my podcast. I really enjoyed chatting with you. I could have asked many more questions. Like, even as I'm talking to you, I'm sort of thinking of things I could sort of ask you, but it's just going to go on too long. So thank you for coming on my podcast. For people who are curious about you and want to know more about you and your books, including Aristotle for Novelists, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if anybody is interested at all in anything that I'm doing, the easiest place to go to is my name, DouglasVigliotti.com. You can get a link to absolutely everything. And if you want to know more about the book, I also make it very easy, Aristotle4Novelists.com. There's also a 10-question assessment on that page. There's more information about the book. There's testimonials. There's all kinds of stuff that people can learn more about the actual book if they're interested in it. And then the podcast is very simple, booksformen.org. It's available on all different podcast platforms, or just, you can find out plenty of information at the website. And yeah, those are the easiest ways. And if someone really wants to get a little more personal with me, I have one social media outlet. It's Instagram. I do use it pretty regularly, at least the story component. I share books, I share quotes, I share little pieces about my life, all that stuff. And I try to engage with people on there. So that's probably the easiest way to do that. And you can find me at Douglas Vigliotti on Instagram. Those are probably the best ways.
Yeah, so thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you for listening or watching this episode of the Authorpreneur Podcast, where I spoke with Douglas Vigliotti about his book Aristotle for Novelists, 14 Timeless Principles on the Art of Story. I hope you got a few tips on writing from this interview, or it inspired you to purchase the book. In the comments section below, let me know whether you have read Aristotle's Poetics or what you learned from this episode. Once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Happy reading and writing, everybody! Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur Podcast. If you love this episode, then hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favourite podcasting app. I'm your host, Amelia D. Hay, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!